In the trunk, you want to remove the cover that's covering the spare tire, and we'll disconnect the battery. Use a 10mm socket, loosen up the negative terminal. Take that off and slide it aside. Now we're going to remove this cover. You can just slide it straight up. The computer right here, we can disconnect this, or you can just pull it and slide it aside. I'm just going to disconnect it. Just push down on that lock, slide that off, disconnect that connector. Just wiggle it a little. Slide that out of the way. Same with this one. There's a little tab right here. Push down on that. Slide it off. You can grab the computer, slide it out, and just set it aside. Take this cover off. Just grab the tabs on the side and slides right up. Remove this. Use a 10mm socket. And then underneath here, there's two wires. You want to pull those wires up and out of the way. Now you want to disconnect these two wires right here. You can use a straight blade screwdriver to try to peel back the lock, or some pliers that you can squeeze. And then just slide it back. You just got to push down on that lock. Set that aside. Set that aside. Use a 7mm socket. Take all these bolts, loosen those all up. Oops. They're not going to come out, but you just have to loosen them. On the side, there is some clips. There's one right here. Peel that up, and then one over here. One on the other side over here. And there's one on the back side over here. Slide those up. The connectors should stay down, but if they don't, then you can slide the connectors down. Just push down on the bolts. Go. Set the fuse box aside. Now pull all these connectors out and out of the way. There's a couple connectors that are connected to the box. Just use a trim tool. Disconnect those. It. All right. There's is a retainer right here. You want to take that retainer off. You can try to use a pick and slide it off, or if you just break it and just get a new one. Yep, that's off there. There may be another screw or bolt down there. This vehicle doesn't have one. Then there's a couple bolts down here. There's some connectors that are right here that I'm just going to disconnect so we can get some of these wires out of the way. Just push down on the tab right here. Slide it out. This connector here, the ignition coil. And this connector that goes to the purge valve. And then this wiring harness is just attached right there. Just take that off. You can just slide a lot of these connectors out of the way so you have a little more room to see. And these wires, we'll just move these up here. Right here, I'm going to disconnect the linkage. This is what connects to the shifter. I'm just going to use a wrench. It doesn't matter what size. It happens to be an 18 millimeter. And then a pry tool. I'm just going to pry it apart. It just like snaps in there. That just gives me a little leverage. And the other one, if you can fit in there, do the same thing. It's a little bit trickier to get in there. It's down below. Just try to pry that out. There we go, just popped it off. Now we're going to take this bracket off. There's a bolt right here. You want to use a negative Torx socket in E12. Take that bolt out. Pull this out of my way. And grab the bolt, slide it out, take the bracket, and it kind of slides in down below. There's just a little area where it goes on. It almost looks like there could be a bolt that goes through there. So if yours doesn't slide out, there may be a bolt in there. But set that aside. Keep in mind, the one on the black goes up top, and the more tan one, or the white one, goes down below. It's out of our way. There is a speed sensor connector right here. While you're down there, disconnect that connector. Just lift up on that. Slide that off. And there's a wiring harness that's attached. You want to take that off. Right there. It's easy to get to right now. There's a couple other wires that go back here. If you want to disconnect those, just to get them out of the way. The connector right there, it's for an O2 sensor, and then a coolant temp sensor back here. Take those out. Down here, there is another connector, so you want to reach down in there, grab that connector, disconnect that right there, and there is a retainer holding it on. You can try to pull that off. If you can get in there with a trim tool, and pull that out. That's the retainer. That's the connector. You can slide this whole harness out of the way. Oh, there's another connector down here. Disconnect that. That's for the O2 sensor as well. Just Just use a trim tool, pull that connector off. Now all the connectors are disconnected for this harness. And again, we can slide this out of our way. There's a retainer right here that we need to pull off. Just use a trim tool. Try to get underneath it. It's just plastic. Coolant hose is in the way. Just remember the routing of this when you go to put it back in. You just want to slide it behind this coolant hose and underneath. And that harness is out of the way. Now we're going to disconnect this right here. Use a pick underneath this retainer clip. Just want to pull it up, slide that clip up. You can slide it out completely. And just grab this. You might want a drain bucket underneath in case any fluid is lost. Just a little bit, not too bad. You can just pin this up out of the way. Just to prevent this from leaking, I just put the end of one of the gloves, just cut one of the fingers off and put a wire tie on that. That's just going to prevent it from dripping on us while we're working underneath the vehicle. Just keep that out of the way. I'm going to remove this nut. There's a ground wire attached to it. Use a 13mm socket. And you can take that ground wire off. And then there's a stud. You want to remove that stud as well. Use the same 13mm socket. Take that out. And there actually is another ground attached to that. So set that aside. Try to remember which one was which. That one's for that, and that one's for the outside. There's a bell housing bolt or stud right underneath here. Use an 18mm socket. And then double check, make sure there's not one right next to it. This vehicle does not have any more up there, but it should just look like that. We supported this side of the engine. When we go to take the cradle down, there's nothing going to be supporting the transmission or the engine. So you want more support on this side. On that side of the engine, there is a motor mount attached to part of the body of the vehicle. Double check that. When in doubt, use more chains or more supports than normal. You want to make sure that it's supported on the sides, just like this, and this will work for us. I'm going to remove these 3 bolts right here. This is for the mount. We're going to use a 16mm socket. You can see that drop down just a little bit, and that's okay. There's still other mounts holding this up. Keep that out of the way. Now we're going to remove the wheels on both sides. Use a 19mm socket. Take these hubcaps off and then take the lug nuts off. Pull the wheel off. We want to remove this cover right here. There's a push pin right here. Take this one off. Just use a trim tool. Slide that off. And then there should be some type of fastener right here, whether it's a bolt or a screw. This vehicle doesn't have it. And push pins underneath here. Take those 2 off. And then you can do the same on the other side. Underneath here, there's a screw right here. Just use a Phillips head screwdriver. Take that off. That one just broke. And then there's a push pin right here. that push pin out. And there's another fastener that goes right there. I'm going to unscrew that. There should be some 7mm screws right here, here, and here, similar to this one. You want to take those out and then slide this down. You can just slide this out of the way. Then you can access one more bolt up here. Use a 10mm socket, take that bolt out. Once you get that bolt out, you disconnect this cover. Oops. And you can slide it right out. Just leave that air box up there. There we go. Then we're going to do the same on the other side. Take these bolts out, get this shield off. You're going to use a 7mm socket, take all those screws out. On this side, there's just a push pin, so use a trim tool, take that push pin out. You can slide that down and out of the way. Because of the way the condenser and the radiator are supported by these little tabs right here, we need to support those so that when we take the cradle down, they don't fall. I'm just going to use some tie-down straps and just go over here. Just find an area that you can grab onto. It just goes underneath there. Just tighten that just slightly. That'll hold those up. That's good. I'm just going to separate the ball joint from the lower control arm. I'm using a 17mm wrench and a 15mm socket. Take the nuts off. I'll separate that, just push that aside. I'm going to do this on both sides. And slide that out and out of the way. Before we go any further, we're going to separate the axles from the transmission. It'll be a little bit easier now because the whole drivetrain is still stable. If you do it after you take the cradle down, it's a little more tricky. So if you have one of these forks, use one of these, or you can use a pry bar. Just pop that out. You just want it loose. And do the same with the other one. And that just pops out. There may be some fluid that comes out, or maybe not. So that's okay loose like that. We'll take them out further once more of the stuff is out of the way. We're going to separate the lower sway bar link right here. You could separate it from the top if it's easier for you. Use a 18mm wrench on the back side to prevent the stud from spinning and an 18mm socket. Take the nut off. Take that out and slide the link off. Then you want to do the same on the other side. And slide that out. Now I'm going to remove the bolts for the steering rack. There's two, there's one here and then one on the other side. They're on the top going down, so you're going to have to get creative to do that. You could do this another way and leave the steering rack attached to the cradle. You could disconnect the shaft that goes into the car, the intermediate shaft, but then you also have to disconnect the outer tie rods. And sometimes you can mess some things up, so it's just easier to disconnect it here. Use an 18mm socket. And get that bolt out, and that's loose. Then we gotta get the other one. And we get that bolt out. And this one, you just move the rack a little bit. Even if the bolt stays with the rack, that's okay. You don't have to actually remove it. So we just want to tie the rack up. We can tie it up to the exhaust. And just use some type of strap. Hook it around. That'll be fine. Just gonna use a pull jack just underneath here. Just put a little bit of pressure. I'm gonna take this bolt out here. That's just to prevent the whole engine and transmission from falling. So it's not gonna fall far anyway. We have it supported up top, so just get that bolt out. I'm gonna use an 18mm socket. Take this bolt out. Move the pull jack up a little bit if you have to get that off. That's good. Now we're going to take these three bolts out here, use a 15mm socket. We still have the pull jack supporting the engine and transmission. Now slowly I can lower the drivetrain. That's okay. Now I'm going to support the cradle. Right here. Then I'm also going to support it in the back. And then I'll take out the cradle bolts. I'm going to use a 21mm socket, take all the corner bolts out. They should all come out like that. Is it off? I think it's off. Yep. There it is, friends. That bolt can stay there. That's fine. That's the last one. Should come right down. Yep, go ahead. And just make sure you have a helper and just pull this down nice and easy. You can lift it off and just put it aside. Now I'm going to take these bolts out. I'm going to take this bracket off. Use a 16mm socket to take these three out, and then we're going to take this bolt out. bolt is a 15mm socket. Take those off. You can just slide this out of the way. If you have to, you can take off this other bolt, but you should be able to just twist it like this and pull it down. To remove the transmission, there's 2 bolts that go through the starter that attach the engine and transmission all together. So we have to remove those bolts. If you can get those bolts out without taking any of this other stuff off, go ahead, but it's very difficult. So we're going to take this pump off and then we'll just pull the starter off just to get those bolts out. Disconnect the connector right here. If you need a little pick or a screwdriver, just get underneath these little tabs. Slide that off, out of the way. There's a couple of hoses up top here. I'm going to just push down on those, pull that one off, and there should be another one right next to it. If you can't access that one now, you can pull it down a little bit and then try to pull it off once it's down. And that one's a little tight, so. All right, I'm going to take these bolts out for the bracket. Use a 13mm socket. And then these 2 bolts as well. Push that connector right there. Try to pop that hose off. There we go. I use an 8mm socket. Take this nut off. Slide that wire off. Use a 13mm socket. And slide that wire off. And this just happens to have another wire underneath. Slide those off, out of the way. Now we're going to take the 2 starter bolts out. There's one down here and one above. Use a 15mm socket. Take those out. I'll just use an extension and take the other one off. And take the starter and slide it out. We pulled the starter out to access this bolt right here. If you can get this bolt out without taking the starter out, go ahead and do that. It's just really tight in there, so it's a little bit easier just to pull the starter out. Now we can pull the rest of the axles out completely and set them to the side. Just like that. Just let them hang like that, it's fine. Do the same to the other one. Actually, this one I'll just string up over here. And slide this axle out as well. And out of the way. If you want to tie it up, you can, or just let it hang. Now I'm just gonna support the transmission jack. What we need to do is tip the engine and transmission down so that the transmission can pass. There is a part of the frame that is in the way, or part of the body that the transmission won't be able to get past. What you could do is, before you drop the cradle, have a little more slack on these chains, but I always like to come back later and loosen the chains if I have to, rather than have too much slack. Because you don't want the drivetrain to just fall suddenly. So we can just lower this down, and you can lower it down pretty far. You can just make sure none of the hoses or anything have too much tension on them, or any of the wires. The air cleaner, everything looks good. So we'll just drop it down a little bit more. And that should be good right there. And now we're going to take out these bolts. Those are 18mm bolts we're going to take out. Using a 18mm socket. And these two, the last two. You can see the transmission separated a little bit. I'll just take a pry bar and just pry back. If you notice the gap's not getting bigger, you probably have one of the bolts still stuck in it. So just make sure you get all the bolts out. Slide it out, go down a little. Just gotta tip it down. Come down. Slides right out. Now we can take a 10mm socket, take these bolts out. We go to take the last one out. You want to hold the clutch plate, the spring plate, and slide it off. Before you put the clutch back on, what you want to do is take this flywheel off and send it to a machine shop and have it machined, especially if it's the first time it's ever been done, then it hasn't been machined before. There is some hot spots in this. It might even be best just to replace the flywheel itself. If you just put the clutch on, it may work for you, but it could wear out a little bit quicker. So you don't necessarily want to just put it on. So you're going to take the new clutch, line it up like this. It only goes on one way. It can't go this way. It won't even line up like that. And then take the alignment tool. That's going to line that up in the center there. Should be good. If there's any debris or anything, you want to clean that up a little bit before. And take the pressure plate, slide it over. And you can see this does only go on in certain areas. There's a little cutout right there. If you went off like this, it's not going to go. So you have to line it up properly. Get the bolts started. Making sure that clutch is in the center good. And just by hand, I'm just gonna snug these down first. Try to get them all pretty even. Now there is a tightening sequence. You want to start with this one up here. That's number 1. Oops. And then number 2 is down here. So you're going to skip 1. Then number 3 over here. Then number 4 over here. And number 5. And number 6. You can see all the spring, all the fingers went down. Now we're going to torque it to 22 foot-pounds in that same sequence. And number 2. Number 3. Number 4. Number 5. And number 6. You can go around again, just double check. If the flywheel starts spinning, just use a straight blade screwdriver. Just prevent it from spinning. Good, and you can take out the alignment tool. Now we're going to remove the slave cylinder and bearing. Use a T30 socket. There's 3 bolts around here. Take those out. And there's 1 bolt up here. Take those out. Grab the slave cylinder and just slide it out. Now slide the new one in place. And get the bolts started. Then torque these bolts to 89 inch-pounds. get lined up just right. There it goes. Just kind of pry it in. So just make sure those dowel pins are lined up. There's one up at the top here. Oops, that's gonna go this way. And you can use a pry bar and just pry it into place. Looks like everything's lined up. That's good. And you can get all these bolts, get those started. And that one. We can start tightening those down. Just snug them down first. Now we can torque all those to 55 foot-pounds. Now it's safe to lower the support. Just go slow. Now we can raise the engine and transmission. At this point, I can put these mounting bolts back in. They go to this transmission mount. Just try to get it lined up as close as possible. And we can tighten these down. Even though this is secure, I would still leave the support for the engine just in case for now until we get the cradle back up and everything is all mounted underneath. Now we'll slide the axle in. All right, lock it in place. We'll do the same with the other one. Oh. And that one's locked in also. Now slide the starter in place. Get the starter bolts started. And the top one that you can't really see too well. Make sure the wires are out of the way. And you can torque those starter bolts to 30 foot-pounds. Do the same with the top one. Now we're going to hook the wires up. The bigger wires go to this stud, just like that. You want to clean up those terminals a little bit. That's good. Put the washers on and get the nuts on. I'll put the smaller wire over this stud, the washers, and the nut. And we can torque that to 13 inch-pounds. That's it. Now take the air pump, and you want to slide the hoses into position and connect the hoses. That one there, that one there, and just lock them down. Get the bolts started. And snug them down. Line the connector up, lock it in place. Now slide this mount back into position. Get the bolts started. And tighten those down. There you go. And we can put the cradle back in position. That's good. Give it a little pump. I'm getting close, maybe. Go up a little on this side. Yeah, we're looking good. Digits out of the way. Good? I think we're good. And get all the cradle bolts started. And once they're started, then you want to tighten them all down. Awesome. Now I can lower the supports for the cradle, set those aside. When you were putting the cradle up, just make sure that you put the feet in for the radiator into those little brackets right there. And that's all set, so we can take this tie-down strap off. And the steering rack, you can take that tie down off. Now we want to get those steering bolts lined up. Get that one started. And the one back here, it's a little trickier to see. And it might be easier to use a ratchet wrench to get it started. And if you can get in there with a torque wrench, you want to torque those to 81 foot-pounds. But it's a little tricky to get a torque wrench in there. Do the best you can. Tight, and put these bolts in for the mount. If you have to, you can adjust the mount if you have to raise up the transmission a little bit with a pole jack. But this one's lining up good. And we'll just tighten these down. Now for this mount, we're going to use the pole jack. Just slide it up in position, take the bolt, get it started, and we'll tighten that one down. It's good and tight. Lower the pole jack, take the sway bar, line it in position, and put the link in. Get the bolt started, or the nut started. And tighten it down. And if you can fit a torque wrench in there, you want to torque that to 59 foot-pounds. You can do the same on the other one. Now you can line the ball joints up. Get all the nuts started. Slide this panel back in place. Get all that lined up. And there's a bolt up top. Get that bolt in. Should be some push pins. Get those push pins in. Then once all those are in, and line this panel up underneath. And get all these screws in. Some of these are missing. Right there and right there. And tighten them down. All right, that's good. And do the same for the other side. Line that up. Now reinstall the front wheels. The lug nuts started. Do the same on the other side. And we'll torque the lug nuts to 100 foot-pounds in a cross pattern to tighten the wheel down evenly. Just go around again, double check. Put the hubcap on, line up the valve stem with the notch, and then hand tighten the little caps, just using a socket. Not too tight, just snug. And do the same with the other side. Now we can remove the support, take the chains off. Slide that out of the way. Now take one of the top bell housing bolts, get that started. This is the one that has the stud on it. That's going to go on top. If you had another one in the other side, you want to put that on as well. And tighten that down. And then we want to tighten this down, torque it to 55 foot-pounds. Now take this smaller stud, and there's a wire that's going to go underneath it. And that's going to go in right there. Get that one started, tighten that down. Snug that down. And take this other wire that's going to go on top. Put the nut on and tighten it down. Now these wires are going to go get routed the way they came out. Go underneath where the coolant hose is. There is a retainer that's going to go over the stud. Right there. Slide that in position. Then connect those wires. There's right back here. Here's a coolant temp sensor connector that's going to go back there. Plug that in. O2 sensor connector. I'm going to find the O2 sensor. This one you can't really see. Plug that in, and then you can put the retainer in that. Oops. All right. And there's a connector that's going to go right here. One of the speed sensor connectors. It goes right there. Plug that in, lock it down. And then there's two other connectors. This one is another O2 sensor connector that you can see over there. There's the O2 sensor. There's a lot of stuff in the way. Let me see. That'll get connected right here. And just push it down. Lock it in place. And then the last connector is going to go way down. And this one you really can't see. It's on the side of the transmission. Now we're going to put this bracket back in place with the shifter cables. And slide this on down below. With that bracket on, put that bolt in and tighten it down. Now we can line up the attachments for the shifter. And just get it over the basic, over the socket right there like that. Might have to move this a little bit, get it over that socket, and push it down. It should be okay. You can try it from inside the car and just make sure it seems like it's shifting properly. Make sure none of the wires are in the way. That looks good. And I'm just going to cut the wire tie off this hydraulic part of the clutch system. Slide that off. I'm going to lose a little fluid. You can slide that back in position. And lock it in. Now what you want to do, it's a little bit easier since everything's out of the way. You can bleed the clutch system right now. You want to fill up the brake reservoir with the correct fluid. And then you can take this bleeder screw, you loosen it up. What you want to use is a vacuum pump similar to this, and with a little area where you can extract the fluid. You can put a vacuum on that and then open that bleeder, and that works pretty good. Or if you don't necessarily have a vacuum pump, you can open that bleeder screw and just have a hose coming up like this, and then just naturally pumping the clutch. It's going to feel like it goes all the way to the floor and then back very easily, and it's just pumping the fluid out of here. You're going to get all the air bubbles out. Then you can close this bleeder just like that. Make sure it's closed, and then give the pedal a pump and just make sure that it feels pretty good. If it doesn't feel great, then just repeat the process. Slide this bracket in place under this hose. It's going to go over here. That lined up right there. Put these screws in. Tighten those bolts down. And we're going to take the wires and just get them where they need to go. Put the connectors in the same spot they were. Oh, this one's going to go right here. Just like that. Coming around. And we also have this harness. We want to get those in the right spots as well. So this is a computer connector. This is a fuse box connector. So I'll go like that. Here's another one. This one goes right here. These two are going to go in the fuse box there. And line these connectors up over here. Plug the ignition control module back in. Right there. Lock that in. And the purge valve. All the retainers. Those two are good there. This connector is going to go over here against the firewall. Lock that down. Now take the fuse box, line that up. Make sure it clicks in place, and then get all these screws started. Snug these down. Just snug, not too tight. That's good. Now connect these connectors. The white one's going to go right here. Lock it down. The green one is going to go on this side. And the wire's going to still go in that same area right there. And these wires over here, connect those right there. And right there. And we have this stud that's going to go on top. Tighten that down. And make sure it's snug. If you had a bolt or a nut that went over there, you want to put that on as well. Take the PCM, line the connectors up, push it down. And it ratchets down, locks in place. Do the same for this one. And lock it down. And just slide it into position. Any retainers, just connect those retainers that are in the wiring conduit to the frame. A couple of those. That looks good. And slide this cover in place. And you have another cover over here. And take the negative battery terminal, line that up. And tighten it down. And you can put the trunk cover back in, you'd be all set.